Well, good morning. Good morning. Glad you're here this morning and glad you made it. Hopefully you're having a great week or you've had a good week. And I want to say a big shout out to our friends who are sitting in the mysterious third section. Thanks for filling that out. That's awesome. It's good to have some people over in this mysterious third section. And so glad you're here this morning. Real quick, before we dive into things, I want to talk about something a little bit different before we dive into the teaching for this morning and what we're going to talk about with the Firm Foundation. But a few weeks ago, I was with my son and we were walking actually from here to the lunch that we do once a month over in the other building. We were just walking over and he told me as we were walking, he said, "Dad, I think I should be the pastor of Restoration Church." And I was like, oh yeah? And he was like, "Yeah, I think so." And I was like, "Well, that sounds good." And I was like, "So what are you going to do?" He's like, "Well, I'm going to teach. And I'm going to do what you do." And I was like, "Well, that sounds like a great deal, bud." And I asked him, I was like, can I work for you? Like, could I be one of the other pastors?" And he said, "No, I already hired Isaac." Where's Isaac? Yeah, Isaac was already on as an associate. And I didn't even know there were I didn't know there were job descriptions out there. I didn't know he was hiring. I didn't see it on Indeed. Nobody told me anything about it. And Isaac's already hired on. He's like, "No, I think Isaac's going to be the second guy on the staff." I was like, "Okay, well," I was like, "Is Aunt Janessa, is she going to stay on?" He was like, "Yeah, she can stay." Cool. And I was like, "So," I said, "So, bud, why do you think you should be the pastor of Restoration?" And he said, "I think people just want me to be." He's not wrong either. And the thing I love about that conversation, the thing I love about what that is just from my heart, just real quick, going into church planting especially, but being a pastor in general, if you've ever been a pastor's kid or been around a pastor's kid, there's only two ways that goes. One is really good and one is really bad. And it's not always easy and it's not always fun. And so for my kids, it means a lot to me that my kids, like, they want to be here. They've been seen by many of you. They are known by so many of you. That's such an important thing for my kids, but not just for my kids. The kids that come into this place, one of the things I love is that they feel seen and they feel known. I don't know if you have children here or if you have young ones that come in, but my hope is that you feel as though they are known. They're not just like here as just this thing that we have to stuff into a room and we have to get them out of the way so we can all do the real church stuff. But they are known, they are seen, they are cared for. That's such an important thing. And we want to begin, as we talk about this Firm Foundation series that we're in, as we continue to talk about this is an important time to be setting up a firm foundation with our children. This is a little bit terrifying, but my daughter is 9 years old. She represents the median age for the kids in our church right now. She represents the median age. It's about 9 years old. And so we did some math, and that's what these marbles are for. Is these marbles represent every one of these. It's 434 marbles. Yes, we counted. And every one of these marbles is a week that I have left with her before she turns 18. Every one is 1 week that I have. 434 weeks I have until she turns 18. And I hate it. I hate it. It's not enough. This used to be twice as big, and now we're already down to 434, and this week will be 433. Now, this is an important time to be setting up a firm foundation because we only get so much time. If you know the stats on this, the stats are a little bit terrifying, but with children specifically, if you have somebody who's following Jesus now, today, the chances of them accepting Jesus or knowing about Jesus before they were 13 is about half of people that are following Jesus today knew about Jesus before they were 13. About 2/3 started following Jesus before they turned 18. 2/3 of all of us in this room, we had some kind of relationship with Jesus before we turned 18. And that's probably why we're sitting here today, for 2/3 of us. That's a big number. It's kind of scary that I only get 434 more weeks to set up this foundation before I have my daughter go to college or go on to the next thing she's going to do. and be influenced by people who may not be letting that foundation be so firm. And so this is an important time in kids' lives, and what I'm asking and what I would love for you to do is here at Restoration, our kids, it is such an important thing. Because in our community here in Trinity, 34655 will be the only zip code in this area that is getting younger. And over the next 5 years, it's projected to get younger and younger and younger. Now, I don't know if you know how Florida works. Florida gets older and older and older, right? And this is the one area that's projected to get younger and younger because young families are moving into Trinity. As this church grows, we are going to grow in young families. We're going to have kids coming through our doors. And that's not a challenge, that's an opportunity for us to be setting up a firm foundation with the time that we get with them. And so what we're doing here at Restoration, we're going to be changing our curriculum quite a bit. And we have some new curriculum that we're really excited about. We're changing up our model quite a bit because we're really excited about that. But we want to set up more classes. That means that we have to have more volunteers in case you're not doing the math on this. We want to set up more classes. What we'd love to do is get ourselves to the place where we have our nursery, and you know nursery, and if you love to hold babies, that's a great spot to be. You're also not just doing a service to those babies by making them feel safe in church at a young age, but you're also making them feel maybe some young families who are needing a break. I remember when our kids were that age, and it was like, we just need this hour to go sit somewhere else and not have a baby. That's an important thing, but maybe preschool's your jam, and you love having some kids, not as much teaching, a lot of playing, and a lot of just hanging out with kids that age. That's an awesome thing. We have our K through 3, so kindergarten through 3rd grade, which is a pivotal age. If you're in the spot and you're like, I don't really love to hang out with, I don't want to teach kids K through 3, but I can go in a room and I can color with them, or I can be near them, or I can talk to them. Let me tell you, that's important too. That's hugely important, just being near them, being relational in their lives. And then what we want to do is we want to open up a 4th section of that. The 4th section we're going to call Kids Plus, and we want to have a space that after the music part is over here in the service, that the 4th and 5th graders have their own space just for that time of the teaching where they can go and have a space just dedicated to 4th and 5th. And maybe you're in that spot where you're like, I like a little bit of the older kids and that kind of thing. That'd be a great spot for you. It's just part of the service. All these come with video teaching. You don't have to do a ton of that stuff. What we're looking for is that we want to build in these values that we see so important to restoration of culture and community in Christ. We want those instilled in our children at a young age, that they know how to deal with the culture that they're in, that they know how to live in community with one another, and ultimately they experience Christ. We don't believe that's something they should wait for. We believe that's something that should happen right now. And so I'm just going to ask you, if you would like to be a part of that, just put something down on your Connect card, write that down, drop it in the box, come talk to me, come talk to Janessa. We'd love to have you on our team. Last thing I'll say about that right now is we are also trying to move our student ministry, which is once a month. I do this once a month at the first Sunday of the month. We are growing like crazy in middle and high school students. And if you're a person who likes to work with middle and high school students, we could use your help. And we'd love to move that from one Sunday a month to every single week here very shortly, because we think it's going to be really important. So again, if you're in that boat and you're like, I love to hang out middle high school age, then please come let me know. We'd love to have you be a part of that as well. Okay? Okay, so I'm going to try to clumsily transition us into teaching now. And I was thinking about this as I was talking about this. Yes, and scene. I would like to try to transition us into this. I was actually thinking about this as I was thinking about this teaching and what we're going to talk about with the kids, is I was thinking about the people who, when I was young, influenced my life. Because I was in churches. My dad was a pastor, so we moved from church to church occasionally. We would go from one church to another. I remember we were living in Daytona Beach, and I was born in Daytona. We went to a church there. It was a great church. And I remember I had this teacher there. His name was Mr. Green. And Mr. Green, he apparently was funny, but I didn't know it at the time. I remember recounting the story later and being like, oh, that was funny. But did anybody have churches when you grew up have a hanging of the green service? Did you have a hanging of the green service? It's when you would go and you would decorate the church for Christmas and you would put up all the greenery. And I remember Mr. Green, I asked him one day, I was like, hey, are you going to come to the service this weekend and do the hanging of the greens? And he pulled me aside and he goes, Kevin, I will never bring my family, the Green family, to a service called the hanging of the greens. I was like 6, I didn't get the joke. Now it's pretty funny. Mr. Green was funny, apparently. I didn't realize it at the time. I remember Mr. Green, and Mr. Green was like a Sunday school teacher for me. He poured into me. And what was interesting, I remember as I was leaving Daytona, this is really fascinating, but this still sits in my office. I have no idea why I kept it, but Mr. Green gave me this little statue when I left Daytona and moved to Wyoming. I still have it. I really don't know why. It's not something it's not necessarily my style, because it's not plaid. And I mean, it's a plaque, but it's not like a plaid plaque. It's hard to find plaid plaques. But he gave me this, and I remember him giving this. So we moved from Daytona, and we moved to Wyoming, which is a big jump, guys. We went from Daytona Beach, Florida, where humans live, to Wyoming, where antelope live. And we were there, and we moved to this other church, and I had this other teacher there, and her name was Miss Shackleton, and she was great. And Miss Shackleton, when we left there, we moved from Wyoming, and again, I don't know why, I really can't tell you why I kept this. When we moved from Wyoming, she gave me this little sailboat that told me something about the will of God and the grace of God and that whole thing, and it was like this little sailboat. I remember her giving me that, and I, for some reason, still keep it in the office in the old dorm over here. I had this sitting on my desk. These are things that people have poured into me. As I think about the churches and the locations we've been a part of, I remember there was a man who taught me when we moved back to Florida. There was a man who taught me in church, and I was fortunate that we had a lot of male teachers, and he taught me in church there. He poured into my life there, and I remember one day he decided he was going to take me to soccer practice because my dad had passed away. Only my mom was there, and she had a lot to deal with. And he was like, "I'll take him to soccer practice." I got to soccer practice. I didn't have cleats. I remember him taking me from soccer practice, go buy me cleats, and take me to soccer practice the rest of the season. Like people like that. That's what a church is supposed to look like. I believe that's what a community is supposed to look like. And what I found is, what's interesting is no matter where we moved, the thing that we get attached to, I think sometimes in the church, is we get attached to a location. But the location is not what does this. This isn't what changes lives. It's other lives that change lives. It's not location, it's lives, right? It's not the place you're in, it's the people that are in that place that make that thing happen, right? And I want to talk about that today because one of the things that I think we get tripped up on a firm foundation, we think about firm foundations, is if we're honest with ourselves, if you're like me, one of the things we can get really tripped up on is we can find religion to become our foundation. And I would say that religion is one of the worst things that we can build our lives on. Because what we start doing is we start trying to please a church or a congregation or a community instead of trying to please a creator. And this is a real dicey thing. And maybe you're like me, you've been in church a long time. There's been a lot going on. And what happens is we get attached to a location instead of attached to lives. We get attached to this place instead of people. We start missing out on what we're supposed to be attached to. I would say that we get attached to places and we start to lose out on being attached to the person of Jesus. And we have to be attached to the person of Jesus, not the place. And so today I want to look at some verses and we'll kind of see how this goes. I got a lot of thoughts about this and we're going to spend a few minutes like on one verse and kind of unpacking one verse. And then if we have time, I want to go through the entire progression of Jesus's life, which is a few things, and I want to get us to how his entire life plays to this one point, okay? So we're going to try this out. We're going to start in the book of Matthew, okay? So in the book of Matthew, chapter 24 is where we're going to start. Now, if you're turning there, you're going to just kind of keep a thumb there because we're going to come back to this a little bit. But in Matthew chapter 24, it's verses 1 and we're going to start with just verse 1 actually, and then we'll come back to verse 2, okay? So the very first thing it says in Matthew chapter 24, if you have a little header in your Bible above it, it says signs of the end of the age or signs of the end times. That's part of what Jesus is doing here, but this is so much bigger than just about the end times or about a prophecy. This is a massive, massive moment that Jesus is having with his disciples. So they've been in the temple, they've been in Jerusalem, and all of a sudden it says this: Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. Okay, so the disciples stop Jesus. They're in the temple. Remember, this temple is this thing that's been built. It was built about 1,500 years before Jesus. It's been torn down. It's been rebuilt. And now it's standing, and it's this big temple. Jesus is in the temple, which is the religious center, and he's leaving the temple. And his disciples come up to him, and they call his attention to the buildings. Again, keep a finger there if you can, and flip over real quick. Let's go to Mark chapter 13. And again, you can keep a finger there if you can. Mark chapter 13. Notice this comes up again. Same thing. Mark chapter 13, same passage, a little bit different phrasing. It says, as he was leaving the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." Okay, so this disciple is really impressed with the stones. And what a massive and magnificent building. It's so pretty. It's so nice. Look at this thing. Isn't that great? If you flip over just one more time, flip to Luke chapter 21, verse 5. Luke chapter 21, verse 5. I really should have marked these off in my Bible. So Luke chapter 21, verse 5, and what we have there is we have the last time that we'll see this come up in the Gospels, but all three of the Synoptic Gospels will say this. This one says, some of the disciples were remarking about how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones and with gifts dedicated to God. So notice this, all three of these Gospels try to tell us about how important this moment is. Jesus is walking with his disciples. They stop and they're like, man, what a beautiful temple. And these stones are gorgeous. There's something about this thing that's just amazing. They can't help themselves but to point this out to Jesus for some reason. They have to. Now, you might be like, why? Why is this so cool? Why is this so important? The one thing we do have to remember is that Jesus and his disciples were young guys. They were probably maybe like upper high school at this point as they're going together, and maybe 18 years old, something like that. Most of them are from small cities, and they're like in a big city. They're from another place, and to culturally immerse themselves in a new place is an exciting thing. So it's like they're on their senior trip or whatever, right? Like that's what's happening. I remember we took a group of students from, I used to live in West Palm Beach, Florida, and we had a group of students there, and we decided to take them like onto a cultural immersion thing to a whole nother part of the country. And so we took them from West Palm Beach to Wyoming to go to Wyoming and to see that. And most of these kids were Haitian, and they'd moved to America, and they had never seen anything like Wyoming. And so they were like taking it all in. Like I remember the first day we got there, it was June, and it snowed on the mountain. And so we took them up to the mountain, and I remember some of the kids like that had never seen snow before, like this was all new, and they're just like so excited. They bend down, they're like touching the snow and feeling it, and they got hit in the head by a snowball, by somebody who knew how to make a snowball, and they had to figure out how to make a snowball. And so we did these things that were like a different culture, and they were like all in. Like, I don't know if you've ever been on a trip like this, but it's just like you go all in on the culture, right? We had a kid, we were at a restaurant, and they had a specialty, a delicacy on their menu. It's called Rocky Mountain oysters. And I don't know if you're familiar with these. If you know how a bull becomes a steer, if you know what the leftovers of that situation are, that's what they are. And they're fried, and they're gross. And we ordered them, and we were like, kids, these are a delicacy. You're going to love them. This is a Wyoming thing. You got to try them. And all the kids were like, oh, if it's from here, then I got to try it. I got to get me some of that. And they're eating it, and they're like, this is so good. And we had one kid who literally, I was like, what do you think? And he goes, it's like heaven in my mouth. Like, I think you missed the point. Oh, no. I think that's not heaven. That's something very different. They're fully immersing themselves. It's kind of like that, but what they're doing is they're missing the point as well. Right here, the disciples are in this spot where they're looking at this thing because they're like, it's so beautiful. This is so fantastic. We're immersing ourselves in this culture. This is so great. But what we're missing is what's really going on. They're not seeing the full picture. Here's what they're seeing. Here's their viewpoint of what's going on. Is first of all, we know that the temple would have been really an amazing place physically. Physically, this was a remarkable place. At this point in Rome's history, Herod was actually rebuilding this temple himself. So Herod, who was over this area and this precinct, he would have been the guy. He loved building projects, and he saw this honestly as kind of a tourist trap. He saw it as a place that you could make a lot of money. And if you've been to the Holy Lands since then, what you know is this is still true, is a lot of these places are also money makers. And he saw this as, if we can restore this temple to what it was and make it beautiful and make it bigger and better, more people will come here. So what he did was he started pouring money into this. Herod was known for this. And what he did was, instead of just building the temple the way it was, he started using his own materials. That's why they're so into these stones, is because there's a certain kind of stone called a Herodian stone. There's not many left. The Herodian stones were these massive bricks. They were made out of limestone. If you're familiar with limestone, it's very, very heavy. They were made from a quarry about a mile away from the temple. It took over 1,000 oxen to move these over and over again 1 mile away to drag these things because they weighed about 50 tons per stone. The cornerstones weighed about 80 tons per stone, and some of them were actually lifted up almost 100 feet in the air to be cornerstones. I mean, it's crazy, this building construction that he's under, this massive renovation that he's doing. They are literally beautiful, and they're well made. If you go to the Holy Lands now, you can still find those. You can still find those stones on the west wall of Jerusalem. There's still some of these Herodian stones standing, and there's still a few around the Temple Mount. We'll get to why they're not there anymore, because it's kind of fun. We'll get there if we have time at the end of this. But those stones were standing, and they were so amazing. And so this project is taking place, and it's this beautiful project. So they see it as, first of all, this physically beautiful place. But what's more important right here is they see it as this spiritual place. They see it as a spiritual place where the Spirit of God is held. And it's like literally the center of their life spiritually is right here. And I mean center in a specific way. Because what's happening is, if you know the temple, there were different layers that you could go through. It was almost like a concentric circles of getting closer to God. Now, that's not necessarily the way the temple was supposed to be built. If you go back to 1 Kings, you'll read Solomon's prayer when he dedicates this temple 1,500 years before. And what he says in his teaching in his prayer, he says, "The heavens and earth cannot contain you. How can a temple contain you?" Like, you're bigger than this. But because of what had happened in the religion, because of what the Jews were doing, because of the tourist traffic this thing was going to become, because of all these factors, all of God's presence was believed to just be within the temple. And there was part of God's presence there. He did do work within the temple, but that was not the only place his presence dwells. And so what happens is they see it as these concentric circles of getting closer to Jesus, or getting closer to God. And as they look at it, I mean, if you know the temple courts, there would have been courts on the outer square. These are called Gentile courts. Anybody was allowed to go in there. Gentiles or Jews could go into the outer square of this. And then if you moved in one layer, you had the Jewish courts. That's where you would do your sacrifices, your washing, those kind of things. You could do those things in the Jewish courts. Then inside of that, you had a place called the Holy Place. It was because it was a holy place. And that was a good naming. They had a marketing team. And so they came up with the Holy Place. That was what's going on in that. And only priests could go into that part. But then once you were inside of that, there was the place called the Holy of Holies, where God's presence did business with his people. If you're not familiar with the Holy of Holies, it had a big curtain that went across it. It was about 30 feet high, and it was this massive, inches thick curtain that went across the Holy of Holies. And once a year, the high priest could enter the Holy of Holies. And he had to go in, if you're not familiar with how this worked, he had to go in and they would put a bell around his neck, and then they would tie a rope around his ankle. And if he went in and was not found holy by God, found clean by God, he would be struck dead immediately. And so they put the bell on his neck so they could hear if he fell, and then they put the rope around his ankle so they could just drag him on out, because nobody else is going in there after him. That's a true story. No pressure if you're that high priest. No pressure at all. And so this was the Holy of Holies. This is the holiest place. And if you think about these concentric circles, you can literally feel a separation between the life of the people and the location of their religion, the location of their spirituality. And I would just challenge, I would just say, I believe we have a similar problem sometimes, is that we don't connect what happens in this location with what happens outside in our daily lives. It doesn't get connected very well sometimes. Sometimes we like the things we do in this location. We like the things when we feel good about the spiritual things we're doing, but they don't connect to our lives outside of this. I remember as a kid, one of the churches my dad worked at, if you've ever been a pastor's kid or know them, you get stuck in church a lot, and it's just a lot of time in church. And I remember there was one time we were in one of the churches we were at, had these big pews all the way down. It was this bright red carpet, because for some reason that was a good idea. And so I remember we were playing tag, me and a couple of my friends were playing tag in the sanctuary at the church. And I was really proud of myself because I was super fast because I knew my way around the sanctuary pretty well. And so I was running from the back to the front, and I was on top of the pews, and I was jumping pew after pew to get away. And guys, that was good. Like, I was real good. I could have been a hurdler, but only of pews. It's a very specific type of Olympics. I'm not saying everybody can do it. So I'm running from the back to the front. I'm very proud of myself. I'm running as fast as I can. And I remember an usher, his name was Larry, and he happened to be there. Larry was a great guy, and he was a great usher. He was very good at ushing. I'm not sure what ushers, he's good at ushing people. And he came up to me and he was like, Kevin, you can't run in here. And I was like, and so I just stopped and I was like, oh, Larry. And I asked him, I was like, why? Why can't I run in here? Now, I expected to hear, because you're going to tear something up, you're going to break something, you're going to run into somebody, whatever. What he gave me the answer is because this is God's house. Because God lives here. You can go play in the parking lot. Wait, so first of all, is that safe to send a kid to the parking lot? That's a whole other question. But secondly, so God's presence isn't in the parking lot? You're saying God's presence is just here? This is where it is? This is it? And then like I go to the parking lot and it's over? Like that's different? I can go run out there because God's presence isn't out there. I can't run in here because God's presence isn't here. I mean, I think it's fascinating if you think about just the differences between the way we act in the parking lot to the way we act when we're in the sanctuary. I think this is what Jesus' problem with this is. If you go back to Matthew 24, he says this, where we started in Matthew 24. Remember, the disciples, it says, Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. And notice what they start with. They start with the words temple. Notice how important that word is. Temple, that's a big word. That's like an important word. That's a sacred place. The next word we see in there is buildings, is the last word of that phrase. Buildings, notice it's been downgraded from a temple to a building. And then notice what Jesus does. He takes it even further. In the next verse, he says, do you see all these things? In verse 2, he says, do you see all these things? Which drops it down another notch. These are no longer buildings and temples. These are now just things. And then he says, I tell you the truth. Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. Not one stone. He has just taken it from temple to building to things to just a bunch of stones. And I think it's because Jesus has a hard time with us not connecting the things that happen inside that temple to the things that happen outside that temple. I think we have to see the parking lot as the same as the sanctuary. I mean, seriously, what were the conversations? How did your conversations change? Maybe even this morning, but some other mornings. How do your conversations change from the time you're in the car with the kids and it's crazy and all the things are going on and you're yelling and there's like lots of words being said that you might not be needing to say, and like you were trying to get out the door and of course your wife's trying to get you out the door and she's like on time and you're like sitting there with like one sock hanging off, sitting on the couch like, oh, we need to go now? And then and then you have a conversation in the car, a little discussion, and that thing gets ugly, whatever it is. How does your conversation change from the time you're in the parking lot to the time you're in here? How does your thought life change from what you were thinking about a few hours ago or a few days ago to what you're thinking about when you're in here? How does what you look at change? The things you're looking at on your phones right now change from last night to this morning, from this week to right now. How do those things change? They're maybe not congruent. We do different things in here than we do out there. I mean, as the great philosopher Jimmy Buffett once said, there's a fine line between Saturday night and Sunday morning. He's not wrong, because I think a lot of us, things look different on Saturday night than they look on Sunday morning. And here's the thing is, either it needs to be all one or all the other. Either when you come in here, it needs to look like what your week looks like, and that's okay. Or the other way around, when you go to your week, it needs to look like what it looked like in here. The two need to be connected. They can't be separated. And I don't think Jesus likes them being separated. It is terrifying when you think about the ramifications of this. One time when I was working at a large church in Washington, and I was on stage every weekend, and there were thousands of people that came to this church. And I remember there was one day where I got an email from a guy who said, "Hey, I go to college here in town. I'd love to intern for you. Can I intern for you?" And I was like, "Sure, let's meet. Let's get together. Let's grab coffee, and we'll talk about you interning." And so I showed up to coffee with him. And I didn't recognize him at all. And he said, I said, my name's Kevin. He said, "Hi, I'm RJ." And I was like, "Great to meet you, RJ." And we started talking. And I said, "RJ, are you new to the church? I don't think I recognize you." And he was like, "Well, no, I've been there for a while." And I said, "Well, it's great to finally meet you and put a face to the name. I'm glad we got to meet." And he goes, "No, we've met before." I said, "Wait, we met like before this?" And he was like, "Yeah, we've met." And I said, where was that? And he said, well, we met, I was working at a shoe store where you came in to buy your wife some boots. And I said, well, that's great. Why didn't you introduce yourself? I would have loved to have met you. And he said, oh no, I just wanted to see how you acted and see if the guy on stage is the same guy who's buying shoes. I was like, so how'd I do? And he's like, it's good, otherwise I wouldn't want to intern for you. I'm just saying that I wanted to see. I mean, that incongruency, there's a world watching us right now. And there's a world that's seeing these as non-congruent. They're seeing us as loving to go to a place, but not being the same person when we leave that place. They see us as loving to go to a location, but that location is not connected to our lives outside of it. I mean, can you imagine a world where the way you acted in a church lobby today is the way that you acted when you were at work, the way you acted when you were at home, the way you acted when you were like on social media, the way you acted as a student in school? I mean, can you imagine if that's how things worked? Can you imagine if the teaching that you hear like week after week after week, can you imagine if those things were congruent with like actually living them out? I mean, these things, they sometimes separate. And what Jesus is frustrated by, he takes this from a temple to a building to just things, to stones, because he's saying that you've put too much stock in that. And you love going to that location, but you don't like living the life. And he didn't come here to give us a new temple. That's what's fascinating about Jesus. He didn't come here to build a new earthly temple. That's not what he came here to do, which I think is fascinating about Jesus. If you think about it, what Jesus should be coming to do is we think of him as a religious leader, right? So as a religious leader, he should be showing up to earth and making a new temple and making a new, here's a new thing and here's a new building for you. And Jesus doesn't do that, which I think is fascinating. He doesn't do that. In fact, it says that there is no temple anymore. He says these things are going to break down. They're going to just become rocks. Not one stone will be left upon another. But let's look at what he says about this temple. If you go to John chapter 2, we're going to try to just kind of fly through a few things because I think this theme of Jesus' life is so important. This isn't just an isolated event. This theme shows up throughout the Bible in his life. So John chapter 2 is where Jesus' ministry kind of begins. Now remember that John already writes in John chapter 1, verse 14, John writes that Jesus comes and it says that he dwells among us. And that word dwells in John 1:14 is the word tabernacles or temples. Jesus literally comes to dwell or be this temple for us. And what's in that word temple, the idea of a temple is the connection of heaven and earth. It's a place where the two meet. And Jesus comes as the place where heaven and earth meet. And that's what we see here. And then it says in John chapter 2, he starts a little brawl here. This starts in chapter 2, verse 13. It says, when it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found men selling cattle and sheep and doves and others sitting at table exchanging money. So this is Passover. Just real quick, let me just tell you this is Passover. So at Passover, you would have to come to Jerusalem. You would have to make your sacrifices. And so many people didn't travel with animals to go there. They would show up and they would buy the animals there on the temple floor. That was easier than having to transport like a sheep across all these places. I don't know what their state line regulations were, if you could take a sheep across state lines, but they would have to do this. So they would get there and they would buy from the people there. But what's happening is these people are profiting considerable amounts of money off of this sale of sheep or of doves. They're making a lot of money off of it. The temple has become corrupt at this point. They see it as a place where they are now able to profit from their religious stuff. I know it sounds crazy to think that people could ever profit from religious things. I know it's crazy. Imagine a world where that could possibly take place, okay? But they're doing that. It's becoming corrupt, and Jesus is not real thrilled about this because it's becoming so corrupt. In fact, at this point, just so you know, some of the Sadducees, they were people who were kind of over the temple. There have been bottles of wine that have been discovered recently in Sadducees' homes that in their day, these bottles of wine would have cost over $5,000 in their day. And these were people who ran the temple. There were things that they were doing that were corrupt, and Jesus comes in and he sees what the temple has become. He's saying, this isn't what it's supposed to be. This isn't how it's supposed to go. And what he sees is the hypocrisy happening. This is what I'm so afraid of, is that our world sees people who like to go to a location, but they don't like to live lives. They like to do this one thing, but they don't want to they want to go to one place, but they don't want to be that person outside of here. And honestly, there was a study done about, it's been almost 15 years now, but there was a study done, there's a great book called Unchristian. And there was a study done by people just asking. At that time, they were asking the millennial generation. They were saying to the millennial generation, what are the first words you think of when you hear the word Christian? What's the first word you think of when you hear the word Christian? The number one word was hypocritical. Number 2 was judgmental. Number 3 was anti-homosexual. Number 4 was too political. I know that sounds crazy, but I think they might have got it on the nose. And Jesus is so frustrated because his people, they're going to one location and acting like that's going to fix things, but they're not living it in their lives. He's saying we have to do both. We have to do both. And so what he does is, after he sees this and what's going on, it says this. So he made a whip out of cords. He goes all Indiana Jones on them, and drove them all from the temple area, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, get these out of here. How dare you turn my father's house into a market? His disciples remembered that it is written, zeal for your house will consume me. And then notice this, okay, verse 18. The Jews demanded of him, what miraculous sign can you show us to prove your authority to all of this? And Jesus answers them, destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days. Jesus doesn't like the temple. He's got some kind of vendetta against the temple. He says, I want to destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days. Now remember, they're thinking of this in Herod's terms. It took him almost 50 years to build this thing with over 1,000 laborers and all these ox. Well, I think it was 10,000 laborers and 1,000 oxen. And he had to build this whole thing. There's no way you can build this thing in 3 days. That's crazy. And notice the next verse says, the Jews replied, it has taken 46 years for us to build this temple. How are you going to build it and raise it in 3 days? But the temple that he had spoken of was his body, is what happens after that. It's his body. He's talking about, I am this connection. I am this place where heaven and earth meet. And no longer will you need this temple, these things, these stones. There's now a new way that we're going to do this, and he is the temple. And if you flip, this is just a fun little fact here, but if you go to Mark 14, I think verse 57. Sorry, guys, I know there's a lot of verses today. It's a lot of fun, huh? So we're going to connect this because this is fascinating. That claim that Jesus makes at the beginning of his ministry in John 2 shows up right here in Mark. Notice this. Jesus is now before Pontius Pilate. He's being tried to be executed on a cross. And they're going to bring the charges of what Jesus has done wrong. And here's what they say. Then some stood up and gave this false testimony against him. We heard him say, I will destroy this man-made temple, and in 3 days will rebuild another not made with human hands. This is what they're bringing up, is what Jesus said. This carries through. In fact, there are some scholars believe this right here, this is more actually by historians than like biblical scholars, they believe that this claim that Jesus made by itself was enough for him to get crucified. Because again, the temple and the government were starting to work in real weird ways, and this is not a good thing anytime this happens. Remember, the only thing that the Romans and the Jewish leaders could agree on was killing Jesus. So before you get too excited about siding with either one, religion or politics, just be careful. And so they've agreed, because of this claim, that Jesus needs to be killed, because he made this claim and said he will rebuild this temple in 3 days. But what happens is he does get convicted and he does get crucified. And if you go back to Matthew 27:51, real quick. So Matthew 27:51, then what we see is, it says, and when Jesus had cried out, this is while he's being crucified, when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. And suddenly the spirit of this dwelling place that God has been dwelling in, this place where heaven and earth meet, suddenly is gone. It's been released. And it says in the next verse, at that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. That Holy of Holies, that huge curtain, that 30-foot high curtain, notice it's not torn from bottom to top. Nobody made a little cut at the bottom and then just like split the seam. It's torn from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and notice what it says there. And the rocks split. These beautiful stones, these Herodian rocks, these massive bricks, the whole foundation that they had believed in for so long is now gone. This place that they had put all of their hope, all of their trust, this firm foundation is now completely gone. Because they had kept putting their trust, kept putting their hope into religion, and they had not been putting their trust and their hope into a relationship. They've been putting all their trust and their hope into a place. They had not been putting all their trust and their hope into a person, the person of Jesus. They've been putting all their hope and their trust into a location, not but putting all their hope and their trust into a life, the life of Jesus Christ. And so many times I think we want to do the same thing. We want to put our hope, we want to put our trust into this idea of religion, and it actually can take us further away from the one we're supposed to be worshiping. And notice after that happens, these stones and all these things happen. And I believe it's 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Paul writes this really lovely verse here. Chapter 3. It says this in chapter 3, verse 16. He says, "Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple, and that God's Spirit, it does not live in the temple. It does not live in the Holy of Holies, but God's Spirit lives in you. If anyone destroys God's temple, now being you, now being us, then God will destroy him. For God's temple is sacred, and you are that temple." So if you go back to Matthew 24, what does this all mean? Like, how do we do something with this? I mean, can you imagine what you would live like and what you would act like and how your life would look if you really believed that everywhere you went, you were carrying God's Spirit into that place? How would that change your life? How does it change your actions when you know that the Spirit of God is not dwelling in some other location, but it's dwelling in your life right now? Here's one thing that I think it does, first of all, is I think that it takes away the just. If that is what you are, if that's what I am, no longer are we just moms. No longer are we just dads, right? There's a holy calling on your life. You carry the Spirit of God within you. No longer are you just an employee. No longer are you just an employer. You carry the Spirit of God within you. No longer are you just a person who works with kids on a Sunday morning. No longer are you just a student in a school. You are a person who's carrying the Spirit of God within you. And so sometimes we have to think beyond the location. We have to think, how is what happens in that location, how is that impacting the life that I live? We have to think not about just going to a place to feel better about ourselves, but taking what happens in that place and putting it into our entire person, letting it infiltrate every part of us. Sometimes we have to start to think outside of just going to one location, but living it out in our lives. Sometimes what happens is this religion, it starts to convolute and complicate, and it starts to separate us and segregate us from a relationship with Jesus. And so this morning there might be some things that maybe we've gotten tripped up on. And maybe there's some things in your life that you look at and you're like, okay, I know that the thing I do on Saturday night is not compatible with the thing I do on Sunday morning. I know that the way I live this part of my life is not congruent with the way that I should be living this part of my life. Maybe there's some things that are like that. Maybe you're here and you're like, no, both go together and I'm a mess on both ends, and that's great. Like, I'm for that. I actually love that. Like, I remember I had a lady come up to me who's a friend of mine, and her name was Lisa, and she wanted me to pray for her. And she came up to me, and she was like, Kevin, I just got to be honest with you. Things are a mess. I think I have cancer. And I was like, you have cancer? And she was like, yeah, I mean, that's just one thing going on. She was like, well, because, I had some problems with my surgeries. And she's like, these things aren't real. I was like, Lisa, I did not know that. Did not know that. And she was like, would you pray for me? And I was like, I'd love to. I love Lisa was just honest. Like, her life was and it was just all there, and it was all good. But both need to be congruent. The way that you're living outside of here should be the way you live inside of here, and the way you live inside of here should be the way you live outside of here. It's not I go there, and when I go there, I do that, and when I go there, I do that. They should be the same person in both places. And Jesus is calling us into that. And maybe there's some things that you feel like I need to settle those scores. I need to put those things back in perspective. Then that's okay. And today I would just ask you just to pray and ask for forgiveness. It's not hard to do. The biggest part of repentance is not really that somehow it's a mystical way that God's going to forgive you. I believe that it's more about us being willing to just say it and just put it out there and say, I'm wrong. I think that's a big thing for us, for our own hearts, not just for God's heart to hear. And maybe there's some things like that you feel like I need to be honest about. If you'd like to pray, I'm going to head back to a prayer room back here. You're welcome to come back there and pray with me. I'd love to pray with you about that. Or you can do that right here where you're at. As the band comes, they're going to sing a song. And as they do that, I'd love for you to just spend a few minutes kind of just taking inventory of your life. Is it just about being this follower of Jesus so that you can come to a location? Or is it being a follower of Jesus so that it impacts every area of your life? Why do you follow Jesus? Why do you need this firm foundation? So if you would, let's stand together, and we're going to pray. The band's going to sing a song, and we'll head out of here. Again, I'll be back in the prayer room if you'd like to pray. Let's pray. Jesus, I thank you for this morning. I thank you for your teaching. I thank you for your words. I thank you for your life that just demonstrated this over and over and over again. I thank you for putting in front of us a new temple, and that new temple that was you is now us. And then as we gather together, but also as we scatter from here, that we can still be impacts in our community, that we can still carry the Spirit of God into our workplaces, into our homes, into our Starbucks, into our schools, wherever we happen to be, that we can carry that presence of God, that you've allowed us to become that temple because of your sacrifice for us. We thank you that no longer do we have to go to one place to meet you, but we thank you that you are everywhere, that you are all places, and therefore we should live the same inside of a temple as we do outside the temple, inside the church as we do outside the church, inside of these sacred moments as we do outside of these, because every moment is now sacred because we carry your presence with us. So I thank you so much for the hope that you give us. I thank you for the foundation you've laid under us. And I pray that we don't put our hope in religion, into a place, into a location, but we put all of our hope, all of our trust into the life that you give us and into the person of Jesus. I pray these things in your name. Amen.